So, everybody, this is Attorney Davis Younts. I'm here with my law partner, Caleb Byrd. Appreciate you joining us once again. Today, we're going to take a little bit of a break from some of the things that we talk about normally and really focus in on the application of just war theory in the real world, why it matters, and we're going to dive into how the Bible speaks to the way we wage war and what is a traditional Christian perspective of just war theory. So, Caleb is going to take the lead on a lot of this discussion today, and that's partially because of his background as a former Army officer, a former senior prosecutor, but he also spent time deployed advising commanders in the application of these legal principles the United States uses, or at least should use, in engaging in warfare. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to try to make this very practical. We're going to give you the Christian biblical perspective, and we're going to go through some historical application and talk about what that looks like, including some analysis of modern conflicts. So with that, Caleb, can you outline for us just sort of the high-level overview of just war theory? What is it? What does it mean?
Yeah, so just war theory is a Christian doctrine justifying the moral use of force between nations. It was originally developed by St. Augustine, who laid the foundations for how Christians should think through warfare. And it was formalized as we know it today by Thomas Aquinas. And so just war theory requires really two fundamental things from a biblical Christian perspective. You need a just
Before
cause. Yeah.
before we before we jump into the details of that, I just want to frame this. So what you're saying is all the way back to Augustine, Christians were thinking about whether or not it was just to engage in war, whether or not there was ever a biblical Christian justification for engaging in war at all. Augustine said, I think maybe there is, and that's where his analysis started.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so you have to remember the context of what Augustine is living through. Augustine is living through the fall of the Western Roman Empire. You have major power struggles. You literally have roving bands who are attacking cities. Especially, not only was Rome eventually sacked, but the further away you got from Rome, like Augustine living in Hippo, they are also experiencing warring tribes who are now bringing wars local to them, despite the fact that they had lived under the Pax Romana for centuries, right? And
Mm,
so Augustine is working and thinking through. We live in a fallen world. In a fallen world, peace is really not the norm. Conflict is the
right,
norm in a fallen
right.
world, and the Christian tradition, going back to Christ, going back to the Old Testament, has never been one of pacifism. And so, how does then a Christian work through the problems of killing another human being in war that is justified and waged by not only by biblical means, but entered into through biblical means?
Okay, great. So give us those high level principles, or at least kind of the way we speak about them today when we start talking about the elements of just war theory.
Yeah, so just war theory requires you to have a just cause to enter into the war in the first place, to get involved. And then secondly, requires just action in war. Now we have Latin terms for these. I don't think we need to get lost in the sauce on what the Latin here is, but the way to really think about it is just cause to enter war and just conduct in war.
Okay. And then in terms of things like we hear about the Geneva Convention on warfare and things like that, how does that interact with just war theory?
I'm going to say probably not well. Part of the problem that we have today, and anyone who has worked in the international law community understands this tension of really what internationally has tried to happen over really since World War II. Is we've tried to create a moral and ethical framework for warfare, uh, but without referring back to our central tenets and where it comes from. And I'll give you an example of this. I remember sitting in the JAG school going over law of armed conflict. And I remember a professor who was at the JAG school, I kind of pulled him to the side afterwards. I was like, "Hey, you keep using, the Latin jus ad bellum and jus in bello, and you keep talking about just war theory. Why don't you ever talk about where we get it from and what it's on? Does that create conflict with our current international structure? And really, in our current international structure, does it actually put handcuffs on us that the Bible doesn't when it comes to warfare?" And
Right.
part of the framework problem that we have right now on the international stage is the fact that we're trying to create a moral and ethical framework without reference to an objective, unchangeable truth. Is number one. Number two, it's a very scientific methodological approach to warfare, which is very hard to do because warfare is not clean. Warfare is not just math. Uh, Anyone who studied the history of war sees this almost intuitively. And then the big problem is, um, it really only matters to the extent of whether you sit on the UN's the UN's Council, uh, and whether you get veto power over the war crimes, right? And so, at the end of the day,
Right.
at the end of the day, all these international agreements are really only um, valid to the extent that the parties are willing to enforce them, and that is not always true either.
And so I think a couple of things, just kind of as we walk through this discussion, it's important to keep in mind, you talked about we live in a fallen world. We live in a fallen world filled with sinful people. So just war theory really is trying to apply biblical principles in a fallen world. So it's never going to be perfect. It's always going to be messy. But the thing that we have done in modern warfare is we have completely divorced these standards that we would like to impose in the conduct of warfare, essentially agreeing these are the rules we're going to follow when we engage in war. The problem is we've divorced them from the Bible. We've divorced them from objective truth, from a biblical standard. That's created all kinds of concerns and issues. But then we're also engaging in warfare with nations that are not Christian nations. So, there's some thought when we talk about law of armed conflict, law of war, Geneva Convention, as I think about it when I deployed and was trying to go over rules of engagement and other things with our personnel. When the enemy doesn't follow the same playbook, right? They're not following the law of armed conflict, the rules of war, and things like that. It creates all kinds of issues and problems as well. So we're not going to get into the weeds. That would take, days. That's I think that was an entire semester for me when I was getting my master's of military and operational arts of science degree. But we're not going to get into all of that. But we're going to apply some big picture principles to historical context and then current context. And there's things about biblical just war theory, because we serve a good God, that clear up some of these, I think, moral ambiguities and gray areas that we get into. But I will say that's why, as you listen to this discussion, that's why just cause, meaning a just reason to go to war, is so critical as we analyze this. So what else did you want to add on that before we talk about some historical examples?
Well, I would just add the note here that a biblical view of warfare requires a biblical view of reality. And part of what has been lost in the way the United States wages and enters wars since World War II, particularly, has been that the United States has approached foreign conflict through an idealistic view of humanity, not a realistic one. And
Oh, that's so important.
this has caused major problems, right? And so the ideal since World War II has been the advancement of democracy across the world, whatever in the world that means. And what we have seen is never-ending wars that
Yes.
become these giant quagmires because what we're trying to do is apply abstract, idealistic theories onto reality that don't shape and mold to the actual reality on the ground.
Well, that's so important too. And the other piece of this, as we think about it, is we haven't officially properly declared war since World War II.
Yeah.
So there's an argument to be made that any of the conflicts that we have engaged in since then, we have to even take a step back and ask the question why and how, and if it was just and if it was appropriate and proper, then why didn't we declare war? Why didn't Congress declare war? It's almost as if ideologically we think, well, if we call it a conflict, if we call it an operation, if we call it a mission, if we call it something else, if we call it, peacekeeping mission or, technical support, advisory support, then somehow that absolves us of some of the responsibility for it. But I really think under just war, and that's what I was talking about with the cause, is if we have a reason, if it is just for us to use deadly force in a cause, then we're starting on the right path of just war. But that's the first question. It's either right or it's wrong for us to enter into a conflict in the first place. And I submit that if there is a constitutionally outlined principle for how it is that we would go to war, then we have to ask questions about what we're doing if we haven't properly declared war. So again, we can talk about that a little more with modern conflicts, but I want to just give us an example of how this works. Go back to America's founding. Go back to the Revolutionary War. You're an expert. You served in the Army. You've done this in a combat setting. Was the American Revolutionary War a just war?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the easier ones to say yes to. And let me just say, just going back to what you said a minute ago, warfare by any other name would still smell like napalm, right? And so having a just cause to enter into war is where we have to start. So if you look at the American Revolution, um, and let's just apply our framework for just cause. So just cause requires a competent lawful authority. It requires a probability of success. It
Mm-hmm.
has to be a last resort, and the reason why you enter in has to actually be just. Um,
So let's look at those. Last resort, I think makes sense when we look at the American Revolution. We can see the British were seizing arms, they were seizing munitions, they were marching on the American colonies, they were imposing their will through military might. Talk to me about when you said proper authority or legitimate authority is another term we use. What does that mean when we look at just war theory?
Yeah, so it's really easy when you have a king, right? So in a monarchy, right, which the British Empire was, their default was, well, if the king says go to war, he is the competent authority to declare war. He doesn't have to go to Parliament and ask permission. He doesn't have to go to judges and ask permission. He is the competent authority to go to war. Now, where this really comes into conflict with the United States is the United States is part of the British Empire. The British wanted to be
Right.
able to say the only legitimate authority who can declare war on behalf of the colonies is the king. And if you reject the king, you can't enter a just war because you no longer have a competent lawful authority. Well, the American response to that was, well, first of all, no, that's not correct. First of all, we have a governmental structure. All of the colonies have their own Congress who
Right.
represent the will of the people. And so this is part of the tension with the American Revolutionary War is does the Continental Congress have the authority to declare war, to wage war, to fund war, etc., against who the British claimed against their rightful king? And so this is where the Protestant Christian doctrines of the lesser magistrate become very, very
Mm.
important. These go all the way back to Luther, um, dealing with the wars in Germany that were happening during his lifetime. And effectively, the doctrine of the lesser magistrate says that every magistrate has a duty to his people, to his citizens, to the exclusions of tyrants above him.
That's
And
right.
so if a king is tyrannical, then the governors, the lords, have a responsibility in defense of their own citizens to check the tyranny of the king up to and including entering into warfare against the king on behalf of their citizens. And so using the Protestant doctrine of not only just war theory, but the Protestant doctrine of the lesser magistrate, it, it's very simple to argue no, the king was acting tyrannically in his use of military force in the colonies, and therefore the Continental Congress, in defense of their own citizens, has the lawful competent authority to declare war against the king.
Right. And so that's where you have things like the Black Robe Regiment and the Presbyterian ministers pre-Revolutionary War that were preaching about the doctrine of the lesser magistrate and really giving a biblical defense of the Revolutionary War, and the justifications for it. Okay, so I think that helps when we talk about legitimate authority. What other aspects of the Revolutionary War did you want to just kind of apply for us and continue to walk through this?
I would say one that rarely gets used today that is historically well played out in the American Revolution is the idea of last resort.
Mm,
It was not the first resort of the American colonies to go to war against the empire. You can see this in the grievances that were sent back and forth to the king prior to the Declaration of Independence. There's a long history of grievances that are being filed, and
mhm.
really, the Declaration of Independence says, we as British citizens are entitled to both individual rights that we are endowed with by our Creator, but we're also entitled to the rights of British citizens. And when you infringe upon individual rights and the rights of citizens, the citizens have at that point a grievance that they can move forward into conflict with. And
Right.
so you have this long history of grievances going back and forth with the crown before the Declaration of Independence, before the first shots are fired. And so the reason that is important is today it really feels like our knee jerk reaction in foreign policy is to go directly to war, not really approach war from a perspective of last resort. If you leave me no other option, then we'll go. But are there other options that need to be evaluated prior to entering into a conflict?
Like tariffs.
Like tariffs, right?
Like tariffs, like sanctions. Well, the other thing too, from our military backgrounds, we're taught that the military, the use of military force, really is just one of a number of diplomatic tools, right? It's
That's right.
one of a number of ways in which a nation, a people interact with the world around them and find their place and their way in the world, and it really must and should be the last resort. And I think there's a lot of reasons, and we'll hit on some of them as we talk about some more modern conflicts when we talk about this idea. And it goes back to the idea of not declaring war, right? This idea that we're just going to engage in a conflict, or we're going to engage in a peacekeeping mission, or we're engage in this, or we're engage in that, but people are still dying. We're still using deadly force. And I think that's where just war theory historically is so important. So I think I tend to agree with you. I think it's very easy to analyze the American Revolutionary War and say, look, this looks like a just war. This was supported by the people. It was supported by theologians and pastors and ministers, and it made sense. It was a last resort, and it really was about ensuring that the American people had their God-given rights protected. And look, so many of the people that came to the United States were fleeing persecution in Europe because of religious discrimination and otherwise. So it really was, I think, just so powerful, all the things around it. And I do think it's a great way to look at just war theory. But I want to move ahead. This is not the time to go into the Civil War, because that's an extremely messy conflict, and there's a whole lot of debate that can be had about that. So again, that's not a sidetrack we want to go down today. I think Caleb and I have both have some pretty strong feelings about how we would apply just war theory to both the cause and the conduct of the Civil War. But I want to go to World War II, and I want to give you a chance to start first, Caleb, and then I'm going to talk about proportionality and conduct in war a little bit. But talk to us about World War II from a just war theory, particularly when we look at just cause.
So when we're looking at it, my question when you talk about just cause is just cause for who? Just cause for the United States to enter the war, the British Empire to enter the war, the French to enter the war. Um, and so if let's just take the United States perspective for a minute. Um, the United States entered World War II justly. At the beginning of World War II, the United States basically stayed out of World War II. Um, we can talk about Lend-Lease and the United States
Well,
participation there.
FDR
Yeah,
only won re-election because just like Wilson had before World War One,
that's right.
and just like FDR promised the American people we would not enter the war. That's the only way he won re-election. That's the only way Wilson won his election.
That's right. And so, what you have at the beginning of World War II, the American entrance, is first and foremost Pearl Harbor, where we were attacked by the Japanese. Now, a lot of information has become declassified about what presidential administration knew and when they knew it, and could it have been prevented or not prevented. We're not really getting into that. The important part here is just cause. A defensive war is inherently a just cause. If you are attacked, you have the right to justly defend yourself. And so the Americans coming into World War II after Japanese aggression in defense of the United States is an important just cause for war. And not to be lost is, once the United States declares war on Japan, Germany declares war on the United States. And at that point, now the United States has a just cause to enter both theaters.
Right. And I think that's critically important. And again, we can be realistic about American history. We can look at, what happened before Pearl Harbor and were the Japanese, manipulated in some extent in attacking Pearl Harbor, and were we warned in advance? Was that a false flag, if you will, on some level to justify entering the war? That's again kind of a debate for another time. But when we try to do this analysis, which is we're just trying to get people thinking in terms of just war theory for this discussion, I do think it's very clear. Again, the just cause was there. The United States was attacked. The Japanese attacked the United States, and then Germany declared war on the United States. And then you have other things about the conduct of war that are there's a lot of examples of throughout World War II. And again, some of them are pretty tragic. We can look at the historical record of the way the Japanese treated the people in China, the way they treated prisoners of war, American prisoners of war. It was horrific, and no one would argue that is proportional. That's not the way you wage war. You can engage in just war, and when you're talking about civilians and you were talking about POWs, in other words, people that are no longer in the fight, they may be wearing a uniform, but they are no longer in fight, they have surrendered. There are just war theory concepts that give us guidance, and really biblical guidance, on how you treat that individual. So, interestingly, despite all the horrors and the war crimes and other things the Germans did, they typically treated American POWs quite well. Now, quite frankly, we treated German POWs quite well. And so there was reciprocation there. And that's part of why you have arguments for the Geneva Convention and other things, is you want the enemy to treat your prisoners justly and fairly, and you do the same for them. But the other things we see when we talk about World War II are just discussions of modern munitions and how that goes into the just conduct of war. Because when you talk about how you engage in warfare, then you begin to come up with questions about what are permissible acts within the conduct of war, and what are impermissible acts, what are unjust, unchristian acts. So there's a couple principles there. Why don't you kind of outline those principles, and then we'll do a couple examples.
So, Juice and bellow, right? So just conduct during war. There's three main historical principles that I think we should probably focus on, which is distinction, proportionality, and military necessity. There's some more modern principles that have kind of been added to this list, but those three are really at the core of what we're talking about today. And so distinction says that you should distinguish between military targets and civilian targets, military populations, civilian populations, right? There's a difference between bombing a military installation, right, and bombing a city next to a military installation. And so
Right.
distinction asks us to distinguish between military targets and civilian targets. Proportionality, uh, proportionality is probably one of the more, if you want to say hotly debated, because what is proportional? And so what you're supposed to do under this analysis is when you hit a target, it should be proportional to what you're attempting to gain from the target. How
Right.
vital, and then this gets into vitality, which is military necessity, the importance of engaging this target um, in order to advance the war, to bring the war to a conclusion. And so distinction, proportionality, and military necessity are really your big three when it comes to conduct in warfare itself.
Okay, so when we think about World War II, again, I'm going to frame it from the Air Force background. I'm going to always frame a lot of these things from the perspective of air power, right? So I'm
Yep.
thinking airplanes, aircraft, bombing, munitions, things like that. Whereas your Army background, it's a little bit different. So we look at Germany and the Luftwaffe, the battle for Britain, the air battle that was fought.
Yep.
Initially Germany targeted primarily military targets, and then they began engaging in nightly bombing raids of London. So at that point, they were bombing the civilian population in the hopes that they could break the morale and the will of the British people, and therefore sue for peace with England and end that aspect of the war. And we'll get into some analysis of that. At the same token, you have really sort of similar thing, the analysis that was being done by the United States when it came to mainland Japan. So I just read
That's right.
The Bomber Mafia
Yep.
by Malcolm Gladwell, and there were a lot of Air Force officers, air power leaders, and then it was the Army Air Corps during World War II that were thinking about how to use things like high altitude precision guided bombing in order to target what we call centers of gravity. Think munitions plants, right? So if an enemy only needs ball bearings for every munition they use, every artillery piece that's mobile, every tank, every airplane needs ball bearings, then the idea is if you destroy their ball bearing manufacturing capability, you're bringing the war to an end, right? By doing that. So that's all the analysis. And the Air Force had this battle. So you had certain Air Force leaders on one side, and then you had tremendous pressure from the British, as well as FDR's administration, then the Truman administration, and sort of notorious, somewhat nefarious Air Force leaders like Curtis LeMay, who wanted to engage in exactly what the Germans had done in London, which was
Yep.
indiscriminate nighttime bombing of whatever you could bomb. And I will say this as well, complicating the decisions the United States made when it came to bombing Japan is, unlike Germany, unlike England, unlike many parts of the United States at the time, Japanese military industry was not separated from the city. So imagine a highly densely populated areas where people are really living within feet of the munitions, where the munitions are being created and other things, because they had a very spread out sort of industrial base. So certainly there were, like Yokohama, some industrial centers, but much of Japan, it was very spread out, and it was very hard to distinguish between military targets and civilian targets. But those are the things we're thinking about when we talk about the conduct of war. And quite frankly, the United States, it's a tribute to the United States that we even had those discussions and thought about those things, right? I mean, you have military leaders in the Air Force in particular saying, hey, do we have to bomb population centers indiscriminately? So talk to me about, pick one of those. You can talk about Germany bombing London, you can talk about our aspects towards Japan, but what are your thoughts? What can you share with us on that?
Well, I would say first and starters, when we're talking about World War II, air superiority is really gets down to the nuts and bolts of what we're talking about here. From an army perspective, tank see target, tank go boom, right?
Right.
It's pretty easy for the infantrymen in World War II to identify, okay, that's a different uniform, I can hit it. Okay.
Right.
It's much different when you're 30,000 feet in the air and you're not
Right.
using laser guided precision bombings that have a little chip on it where
Right.
you can literally steer the bomb if it's going in the wrong direction, right? What we're talking about in World War II when it comes to early air power is we are literally talking about dumb bombs that just fall. It's
Right.
just gravity,
Right.
right?
Right.
Maybe we put some tails on it so it spins a little bit, right? But we're
Right.
talking about dumb bombs here. And
Right.
so distinction, proportionality, military necessity, I think probably my favorite place to start here is the difference between the London bombings and the Dresden bombings that followed. And so if you think contextually, the British Empire has entered the war. Germany has taken France. Churchill is rallying the civilians of Britain and the United Kingdom into a war footing. And one of the worst mistakes that Hitler makes in World War II is the bombing of London, because it
Absolutely.
was at this point where, importantly enough, London is really not a military center for the British Empire. There are
Right.
some very clear military targets in the British Empire, particularly in relation to their navy, in in the North Hebrides, the Scottish Highlands, where Germany could have bombed those targets with the Luftwaffe and not had the rage that was outpoured from the London bombings.
Right.
London was a civic center. It was the center of British politics. And when you start bombing civilian population and political centers, now the war has changed. Um,
Right.
there was no attempt by the Germans to distinguish between military and civilian targets in London.
Right.
It was not, especially at this point in the war, it's not proportional. The British have not bombed civilian populations. At this point, the British are just trying to get their planes in the air.
Right.
And there was no military necessity to target London as a military center. Now, the calculation that Hitler was hoping for was that, well, the military necessity to bombing London is I will take their spirit out of the fight. Churchill will lose support of the British people, and then we can get to an armistice quicker if I hit them where it hurts the most.
Right.
Well, it
Right.
had the absolute opposite reaction, where it absolutely galvanized the British people and empowered Churchill to respond accordingly. And that response from Churchill was the Dresden bombings. Now, Dresden, unlike London, was intermingled with military assets. And here we're not talking about just tailors who are making uniforms. We're talking about munitions manufacturing, tank
Right.
manufacturing. Dresden was an industrial center for Germany. Uh,
Right.
and Churchill also approached this from the perspective that no, if you're going to bomb our political capitals, we can bomb your industrial base,
Right.
regardless of whether there are civilians in that industrial base or not. And so, from the British calculation, Dresden was actually proportional to what was going on with the London bombings. And Dresden also had necessary targets that the British could target.
Right.
Um, Now, again, where this starts to get muddled for the modern man is thinking, oh, well, why can't we just hit the tank manufacturer and not hit Grandma Susie's house? Well, the
Right.
problem with unguided, dumb gravity bombs is that
Right.
you can't, right?
That's right.
If you're going to hit the industrial base, if you're going to hit the tank manufacturing base, you're going to have to hit everything around it because you cannot ensure guidance on that bomb. And so
Right.
this is starts to be where proportional military necessity become into play, because what we are horrified for today in the American public is every time you drop a bomb, you have to think about the number of civilian casualties it will cause.
Right.
Because unfortunately, today with our smart bombs, we can try to mitigate civilian casualties to the maximum extent possible. Sometimes the enemy does not allow us to do so. But
Right. And we're going to talk
um,
about that in a moment. Yeah.
even if you are able to distinguish, you are never going to get away from the prospect of civilian casualties in war.
And so I want to talk about that, because this is where we get into discussions and the debates we can have about the US policy when it came to Japan, right? And the bombing of Japan. And this is one of the questions, and this is for me where I go back to, is this is why just cause is so important.
Yeah.
Because we shouldn't be going into another nation and taking lives if we don't have a just cause. If we have a just cause and we're only entering into war because it's a last resort. And then we recognize why we can do things to try to distinguish between blatant murder of civilians and military necessity and trying to analyze military targets. We need to understand the real question becomes, once we're at war, who is ultimately responsible for our enemy's casualties, right? And part of that comes down to why we talk about legitimate authority and other things. And we'll get into that with modern things. But when we think about, US policy and what we did when it came to Japan, is we really did try, the leaders tried to use daylight, high altitude, precision bombing, using a bomb site to try to target as best they could centers of gravity that were military. The problem is it didn't work. The technology wasn't good enough. The winds were too high. There were all kinds of reasons why they just kept missing the targets. So, the Air Force leader there was relieved. Curtis LeMay came in and he just went and did what the British wanted him to do, which was firebomb Tokyo and kill, just untold hundreds of thousands of Japanese citizens. And again, there's a discussion about responsibility. I think we didn't fully know what the technology would do, just like when we dropped, nuclear atomic weapons. We dropped those. Again, when we dropped those, the United States did pick targets and locations that were not population centers to the extent that they could have. And there was a question of, is this necessary to end the war, or will it cost more lives to do this? So the real debate about this, and we're not going to settle it here, but there is a just war argument to be made. When we went atomic and we dropped those warheads on Japan, the thought process behind it was, this will ultimately save not only American lives, but Japanese lives, because the Japanese culturally would never have stopped fighting, right? And we saw that in the island campaigns where my grandfather fought. It was to the last man. It was suicide bombings. It was, you just didn't surrender. So the idea was, is there a way to show them they cannot possibly win? They have no choice. This war is over, without going house to house and fighting every single living person in Japan. So again, not something we're going to settle here, but I hope you can see some of the biblical concepts coming out, and why, if you take nothing else from understanding just war theory, why I just believe just cause is so important. So now let's go and let's get a little bit controversial, and let's apply this when we think of modern warfare. And again, I have this frustration with whether or not we've properly declared war. But when we talk about Iraq, we talk about Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, and we are going through as JAGs, and we're looking at, okay, what are we doing? How are we doing it? We're always looking at proportionality, military necessity. That's what we're tasked to do. That's what we're taught to do by the law of armed conflict, law of war, all of those things. Even if we don't agree with all aspects of them from a biblical perspective, the idea is, what munition are we using? How smart is it? I mean, is it precision? Is it precision guided munition where we can target, we can target a single car, in the middle of a city? Can we target a single window on a building to take out a single bad guy? Is that the kind of precision that we're talking about, or are we talking about something else? And that really goes to just cause and proportionality. And the reality is, in modern warfare, in any war, there's always going to be civilian casualties. So I want to talk about Israel, and I want to talk about Hamas and the Gaza Strip a little bit. So how should we be looking at? Can we say that Israel, and I'm going to put you on the spot here, can we say that Israel is engaging in just war right now in that conflict?
For me, this is an easy one. Unequivocally, yes. The simple fact is, Hamas started a war they knew they couldn't win when they invaded Israel on October 7th. When not only did they invade Israel, they did so to the target of civilian populations.
So Hamas is the popularly elected civilian leadership of Gaza. They are elected by the people. It was an undeclared war. Well, I mean, they'd say Israel doesn't have a right to exist, but they didn't say today, we're declaring war formally. They didn't do that. So this is one, I don't even know what to call it, nation, sort of, one political entity, if you will, targeting with their approval of their government, their elected leaders, the terrorists, Hamas, attacking civilians and specifically targeting civilians in Israel. Okay. So let's pick it up from there. Sorry.
Okay. So Israel, to me, has a clear justification to enter in the war in Gaza. The question that is really being bandied about in the media today is whether Israel has acted justly, targeting civilian populations in Gaza. And I can really sum this up really in a nutshell, which is the enemy gets to pick what targets are military and civilian.
Hmm.
The enemy gets to decide whether or not to distinguish their own targets. And so let me give you an example. Uh, the Red Cross, because of the rules we have in place and because of the Geneva Conventions and the international agreements that are in existence, you cannot target Red Cross vehicles, helicopters, uh, tents, hospitals, etc., even in a war zone. So if a helicopter has a Red Cross on it and it is ferrying wounded back and forth from the front lines, participating nations are in agreement you cannot tolerate, or I'm sorry, you cannot target that Red Cross helicopter.
Because
Now,
the Red Cross signifies medical personnel
that's right.
treating the wounded, taking care of the wounded, medical personnel. And for Islamic countries, it's a Red Crescent, right? But
That's exactly right.
those are the two recognized symbols. And they'll say, we don't target these because that's medical personnel. They are engaged in the process of rendering aid. And quite frankly, like the US military, medical personnel don't carry weapons
That's
because they're
exactly right.
non-combatants, and
That's
that's a
correct.
Geneva Connection recognition. Okay,
And
sorry
and
to
now,
interrupt there. That's good. Keep going.
so this is really important to understand, right? They are non-combatants. They are medical personnel. Now, what happens is if you take the Red Cross sticker, you put it on an Apache helicopter, and you deck it out with all the bombs and all the guns, and it's firing at the enemy, going to the front lines and coming back from the front lines, and it happens to pick up injured soldiers on the way, that is now a lawful military target. And you have
Right.
chosen to make that a lawful military target by putting bombs and guns on what is supposed to be a non-combatant medical plane, okay, a medical helicopter. So
So
you
same
get to choose.
analysis would apply. So we hear this about, oh, the Israelis or even sometimes the Americans targeted a hospital, or they targeted
Sure.
a school,
Or a
or
mosque.
or a mosque. Can you talk about why? Is that the same analysis? Are we saying that's
Yeah.
because there's a weapons cache there, they have a radio tower, and that's where their headquarters is under the hospital? Is that what we're seeing?
Yeah, now this is really important when it comes to the Gaza conflict, because it's not as though Hamas was using civilian uh, designated areas, mosques, schools, hospitals, um, in a gray zone, right? It wasn't as though Hamas terrorists were running through a school to get outside of a school because they had no other option, right? That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is what Hamas did is they entrenched their military forces in civilian dense populations and civilian recognized sites. So literally, especially with their tunnel network that they created, right, using the relief dollars we gave them, particularly using this underground tunnel network, they were turning schools into armories. They were turning mosques into weapon production facilities. They were turning hospitals into command headquarters. They were turning hospitals into weapons and munition storage centers, right? And so
So they're
what they have,
literally using children as human shields to
that's
try to
exactly
prevent
correct.
the enemy from attacking them, whether it's in this case Israel. And then they're complaining when civilians are killed, but they're also, I mean, they're literally firing rockets from
From the
hospitals. They're
schoolhouses.
firing rockets from schools.
Yeah. Yeah, so they're embedded in the elementary school and they're firing rockets out of the elementary schools. They're embedded in the hospital firing rockets out of the hospital. Guess what? You have indicated to the entire world, this is now a military target. And you got to choose. And frankly, Hamas did this on purpose because what they were trying to create was an environment in which Israel could no longer operate the war in the international community because of the civilian toll it was going to take. But here's the problem. And this is another really good example that, look, there's a lot of people in the military and the JAG Corps today who have a hard time getting their minds around this concept. Imagine there's a bridge, right? Um, Bridge over the River Kwai. All right, and imagine that this bridge is chocked full of civilian refugees who are trying to get over that bridge. But this is the only bridge over the river. The enemy uses this bridge to transport its weapons and ammunition over and its soldiers over the river. And by the way, they're doing so in the midst of a civilian population of refugees that's also crossing the bridge. That is a lawful military target. And the civilian casualties as part of that military target is not the responsibility
Yes.
of of the of the fighters who are engaging that bridge, right? That is, it's called a casualty of war. Unfortunately, it is unavoidable, particularly when in Gaza Hamas is doing this intentionally. They are turning civilian targets into military targets, and then they're crying to the international community when those military targets are hit.
So this is, I think, if people take nothing else out of this discussion as we work on a biblical analysis of this, what we have to understand is there is accountability and responsibility. A
Correct.
king, a ruler, a magistrate is accountable before God for the way that they lead and the way that they care over their people. And a bad ruler is a curse, right? An evil ruler is a curse to those people. And so what you see is there are scenarios where a nation like the United States, a nation like Israel goes to war. It is a just war. And there are going to be scenarios where civilians are killed, but morally, before God, as long as the United States is being cautious and trying to engage in proportionality, trying to make distinctions, ultimately, the goal is to end that war as quickly and effectively as possible. And there will be civilian casualties, but it is the blood is not on the hands of the United States or in Israel in that scenario, so long as it's a just war and the best that you can do in difficult circumstances is being done. But ultimately, those souls, those people are the responsibility of the leaders. And if it's a just war, the evil leaders, right, that have brought their nation into a war or attacked another nation. And often it's the people of that nation. If we're not talking about a dictator or a tyrant, and sometimes it's the people have voted for their rulers, their leaders. They've selected their leaders, and so there is accountability and there are consequences there. And that's a difficult thing, I think, for us to wrap our minds around. But it's just a critical principle because we have to, as Christians, particularly those of us who have served in the military, may be called to do that again, or otherwise, that's the analysis we have to do because we have to say, we have to wrestle with, is war ever justified? Is the taking of life ever justified? When is it appropriate? What's the difference between, self-defense and murder, right? What's the difference between a just war and an unjust war, a just conflict and an unjust conflict? And how does the Bible apply that? So hopefully, I want to give you the last word in just a second, Caleb, and I'm going to really let you give the last word this time. But I just want to say, I really appreciate everybody watching this, engaging in this. If you want to engage in the comments, let us know. It would take a whole lot of people to engage in the comments to convince us to talk about the Civil War, but we might someday in the future have that conversation because there's a lot there to unpack. However, again, thanks so much for watching this. I appreciate it. Study just war theory. If you have questions, reach out to us, comment, and let us know what your thoughts are on this, if this was helpful. And also let us know if there are other topics you want us to try to engage from a biblical perspective. So, Caleb, over to you for the last word.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think you and I are most hopeful about is a return to foreign policy realism, because
Mm-hmm.
the simple fact is that um, war is absolute hell. We're talking about the taking of human lives. It should be
Yes.
avoided to the fullest extent necessary. And then when you enter a war, it should be entered into with ending the war as quickly as possible. That's the moral framework we're working in. That's really what just war theory is getting us to. And what
Mm.
we've seen over the last really my entire lifetime of continuously entering into wars that have no clear objective purpose to end that war is a violation of just war theory. Both,
Well, I'm
uh,
gonna stop you there. I thought we were making the world safe for democracy.
well, and this is exactly the problem. This is exactly the problem with approaching warfare from an idealistic perspective and not an objectively biblical realist perspective.
Mm,
And so
that's right.
our hope is that by reclaiming the biblical doctrines of just war, that what we're now doing is we're moving out of idealism, we're moving into realism, and we can actually get to a place where we can avoid war on the front end because we understand the horrors that come along with entering into those conflicts, and we can avoid them to the fullest extent that we are able.
All right. Thank you for that. Last question for you as we leave. We have declared war on the cartels. We've actually identified several, I saw, different organizations we have identified. We've declared war on them. So Secretary Hegseth calls you, says, Caleb, you're my JAG. Is this a just war? How do you respond?
Well, I'd say my first concern is that we waged war on poverty and lost, and drugs and lost, and we waged war on terrorism and lost, and so I hope this isn't more of the extension of the same, right? Uh, but my response to him would be, you know, if I were in that talk and I were helping advise the Secretary of Defense on these issues, my caution would be: is there a real objective to ending this war? What does that actually look like? You know,
Right,
are we going to be playing just whack-a-mole in North Mexico instead of Iraq now? Is that the plan?
right,
Um, are we working with the Mexican government to use tier one units to specifically individually isolated targets? Right? Is that what we're
right,
trying to do? And
right,
so a lot of those decisions really revolve around those questions. What's the real objective? Are we working? Are we being a good neighbor with the government of Mexico to target and individualize these cartels? What does that actually look like? And
right,
hopefully, my big caution would be: we've just come out of two multi-trillion-dollar wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that we have no objective um, crowning achievement that we can point at for accomplishing anything in either of those wars. Let's not do the same in North Mexico. And so let's have
right.
real objectives. How can we work with our neighbors to accomplish those objectives? And how can we isolate and individualize those targets? Really distinction on a hyper scale in those lawful targets.
Right. And I wouldn't declare war. What I would say it's a state of emergency. It's our border
Sure.
and we're going to defend it. And we're going to use our
Yep.
military to do what's necessary to defend our border. But it is interesting to say we're going to declare war on amorphous entities like the Sinaloa cartel or others. So
Right.
all right, that's really it. We are running out of time here. Again, thanks so much. Follow us on X and let us know in the comments other things you'd like us to talk about it. Appreciate it. God bless you. Take care.
It's left to men like Davis Younts to fight for these Navy SEALs.
All Davis Younts, you are an attorney who has successfully defended naval officers.
Davis Younts has been instrumental in defending.
Davis Younts successfully defended an evangelical Navy lieutenant